He knocked on the door of the poorest woman in the town, dressed in rags, seeking only a plate of food, but ended up finding the greatest treasure money could ever buy. Can you imagine what drives a man who has the world at his feet to abandon his immense fortune to beg for affection and truth in the dust of the road? This story took place in the year 1894 in the sun-beaten lands of the town of Oakhaven, deep in the heart of the Texas frontier. And before we dive into this journey of love, resilience and justice, I want to know where you are tuning in from to follow our tale today. Leave the name of your city and state right here in the comments, because I absolutely love reading where each heart that beats along with our stories comes from. If you enjoy tales about the true value of people and about romances that blossom in simplicity, go ahead and leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any of our emotional stories. The hot wind blew, kicking up swirls of dust on the dirt road as a solitary man walked with a dragging pace. He wore a tattered straw hat that barely covered his face, a dingy cotton shirt, and trousers patched at the knees. His boots were worn out, almost entirely lacking soles, allowing the sharp rocks of the trail to punish his feet with every step. Anyone looking at that sweaty drifter, covered in the reddish dust of the plains, would never imagine that, until a few weeks prior he answered to the title of Baron Arthur Sterling. Arthur was the owner of one of the largest and most prosperous cattle and cotton empires of the era, a man whose wealth was measured by losing sight of where his lands ended. He lived in a grand manor with towering windows, retinues of servants, velvet curtains imported from Europe, and gleaming silver sets. But the Baron had discovered in the worst possible way that gold, though it could buy luxury, was incapable of buying the cure for the loneliness of a broken heart. After being widowed prematurely from an arranged marriage that never held any real affection, Arthur found himself surrounded by a multitude of empty people. They were fellow landowners who smiled at him seeking business partnerships, and dozens of high society women who dressed in silks and expensive perfumes, flashing calculated smiles at every gala. They all wanted the title. They all wanted the money. They all wanted to be the new Baroness, but none of them looked deep into the eyes of the man behind the fortune. Arthur could smell the greed exuding from every false compliment he received. The luxury of his mansion had become a cold and silent prison. The clinking of silver cutlery against porcelain plates during his solitary dinners echoed through the empty halls, reminding the Baron that he was the richest man in the state, but also the most miserable in spirit. It was during a stormy midnight, listening to the rain batter the roof tiles of his manor, that Arthur made the decision that would change his life forever. He summoned his most trusted estate manager, handed him the keys to the safe and the administration documents for the empire, ordering him to keep everything running in absolute secrecy. Next, the Baron took his gold pocket watch out of his vest, unbuttoned his fine linen shirt, and put on the oldest clothes he could find in the seasonal ranch hands' quarters. He needed to know if pure goodness still existed in the world. He needed to find out if someone would be capable of offering a glass of water to the man, and not to the title. And so, leaving his empire behind, he adopted the identity of a penniless drifter, and walked for weeks, until his legs carried him to the forgotten limits of Oakhaven. The town was a haphazard cluster of weathered timber shacks, mixed with a few faded brick buildings, where the strong, pungent scent of chewing tobacco and dark roasted coffee constantly hung in the air. The midday sun punished the roof of the main general store, which belonged to Colonel Silas Montgomery, the man who dictated the rules and the destinies of that entire region. Arthur, his throat as dry as sandpaper and his stomach growling with hunger, approached the porch of the store. Sitting in wicker chairs in the shade, a few modestly dressed young women in starched dresses were whispering with Mrs. Agatha Higgins, the owner of the establishment and the biggest gossip in the whole town. When they saw Arthur's dirty, ragged figure approaching, the girls wrinkled their noses, bringing perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces as if poverty itself were a contagious disease. Arthur swallowed hard and, removing his torn hat in a gesture of well-bred politeness, asked with a hoarse voice if Mrs. Agatha might have a glass of water and some chore he could do in exchange for a piece of bread. Mrs. Agatha stood up abruptly, the brass bracelets jingling on her thick wrist. She looked Arthur up and down, her eyes narrowed in disgust, and answered loudly so everyone could hear that this was no place for a tramp, and that the town didn't support lazy drifters. The young women let out muffled giggles. Mrs. Agatha shooed Arthur away with her hands, threatening to unleash the hounds if he didn't vanish from her porch immediately. The disguised Baron didn't reply. He simply put his hat back on his head and turned away, feeling his chest tighten, not from the humiliation of being called a tramp, but from the sadness of realizing that human cruelty was exactly as he had imagined. Without saying a word, he continued dragging his worn boots down the dirt road, leaving the center of town behind, walking towards the more distant and arid lands, where the green gave way to dry, thorny brush. A few miles away, at the end of a narrow path, lined with rusted barbed wire fences, sat the small property of Eliza Hayes. Eliza was a strong woman, with sun-kissed skin and deep brown eyes that held stories of struggles that no one had ever stopped to listen to. She was in her late 30s, an age when women of the time were already considered too old for marriage, even more so being poor. Her dark hair was always tied in a thick braid that fell over her shoulder, and her hands knew nothing of the luxury of lotions, only the roughness of a hose handle. Eliza lived completely alone. She had lost her parents to a mysterious fever years ago and, since then, fought a daily battle against the dry earth to try to wring a living from her small patch of corn and beans. The silence was her only companion, cut only by the melancholic song of a bird or the thud of an axe chopping firewood. On that particular afternoon, the heat was almost unbearable. Eliza wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, feeling the cheap cotton shirt stick to her back as she tried to fix an old wooden gutter near the well. She was exhausted, her legs trembling from continuous effort, and a crushing worry tightened her stomach. Colonel Silas had sent a message the night before, collecting an old debt that Eliza's parents had taken out to buy seeds years ago. A debt that, with the Colonel's extortionate interest rates, had become impossible to pay. Silas wanted the land. He coveted the clean water spring, located at the back of Eliza's yard, the only thing of real value on that tiny property. Eliza knew she would have no way to defend herself when the Colonel's henchmen arrived to evict her, but her pride and her love for her family's piece of land wouldn't allow her to lower her head. It was in the midst of these dark thoughts that Eliza heard the faint creak of the old wooden gate being pushed open. She stopped what she was doing, gripping the hammer tighter, her eyes half closed against the glaring sun, trying to see who was approaching. The figure of a tall man, his shoulders hunched from exhaustion and covered in dust, walked slowly across the yard. It was Arthur. The man stopped a few feet away, breathing heavily. His face was red from the sun, his lips cracked from thirst. Eliza observed him in silence for a moment. She saw the torn clothes, the frayed straw hat, but upon looking into that stranger's eyes, she didn't find the typical malice of scavenging drifters. She saw only a profound exhaustion and the look of someone carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Arthur swallowed dryly, trying to find the voice that thirst had stolen. He introduced himself as Tom, a hired hand looking for hard labor in exchange for shelter and a plate of food, and asked if the lady of the house had any work for him. Eliza sighed, dropping the hammer to the ground, the metallic sound muffled by the dust. She crossed her arms, and with an honesty that hurt, answered with a gentle but firm voice that she had no money to pay a man. She explained that she could barely pull enough sustenance for her own mouth, that the land was difficult, and the rain hadn't appeared for months. She said that if he was looking for silver or gold, he had knocked on the poorest door in the entire Texas frontier and advised him to head back to town and seek out the larger ranches. Arthur listened to her words, feeling a strange impact in his chest. There was no contempt in Eliza's voice. There was no disgust in her gaze. There was only a painful frankness and a dignity he had rarely seen in ballrooms illuminated by crystal chandeliers. He held the brim of his hat with both dirty hands and looked at the cracked earth around them, saying softly that he wasn't looking for money, because money often hindered rather than helped a man's spirit. He said he was only looking for a roof so he wouldn't have to sleep out in the open, and a few beans to trick his stomach, guaranteeing that he had strong arms and would work from sunup to sundown without complaint. Eliza looked at that man again. She herself had so little. On her kitchen shelf there was only half a tin of lard, a little cornmeal, and a tiny bit of beans she intended to save for the rest of the week. Anyone in their right mind would tell the drifter to move along. But Eliza knew the pain of hunger and the despair of abandonment. She looked at Arthur's worn-out shoes, then at his face, and something deep inside the lonely woman's chest shifted. With a simple nod of her head, she pointed to the side porch of the house and asked him to sit on the wooden bench, letting him know she was going to fetch some fresh water from the well and see what she could rustle up on the wood stove. The disguised Baron walked to the porch and sat down, feeling the immediate relief of the shade on his aching body. As he watched Eliza walk to the well, pulling the heavy rope with effort, he noticed the way she moved. There wasn't the rehearsed delicacy of wealthy women, but there was a real grace in her strength. Minutes later, she returned with a dented aluminum mug overflowing with cool, fresh water. Arthur held the mug with two trembling hands and drank as if it were the most expensive and refined beverage he had ever tasted in his entire life. The water went down, washing away the dryness of his soul. He thanked her, bowing his head in a sign of deep respect. Shortly after, Eliza brought a chipped enamel plate. Inside it, there was a meager portion of watery beans mixed with cornmeal and a small piece of salt pork as hard as a rock. It was next to nothing, but to Arthur at that moment it carried the aroma of the greatest banquet. He picked up the bent metal spoon and began to eat slowly, savoring every bite with sincere reverence. Eliza sat on the edge of the porch, at a respectful distance, shucking some dried ears of corn while covertly observing him. She noticed something curious. Despite being dressed in rags and visibly starved, the drifter ate with a straight back. He didn't devour the food like a desperate animal. He brought the spoon to his mouth in an almost educated manner, without making noise with his lips, holding the edge of the plate with two extended fingers. A strange habit for a man who claimed to be a hired hand, accustomed to the brutality of the road. When he finished, Arthur rested the spoon inside the plate, wiped his mouth with the back of his dirty hand, and looked at Eliza. He didn't use the common slang of trail hands. With a calm voice and his eyes fixed on hers, he thanked her, saying he would never forget such a gesture of generosity, affirming that the meal was divinely prepared and that his debt of gratitude to her would be eternal. Eliza stopped shucking the corn for a second, her brown eyes slightly wide. The polished vocabulary, the perfect pronunciation of the words, the use of phrases like divinely prepared. None of it fit the character of the ragged man in front of her. But she asked no questions. The frontier had taught her that every person carries their own ghosts, and that one shouldn't poke at other people's wounds. She merely gave a half smile, a shy smile that formed small crinkles at the corners of her eyes, and replied that there was no debt between children of God, then pointed to an old wooden barn at the back of the yard. She explained there was a pile of clean hay inside, and that he could sleep there, provided he helped hoe the cornfield the next day. Arthur's first night in the barn was the most physically uncomfortable of his life. The hay pricked through his torn clothes, the cold wind seeped through the cracks in the boards, and the strong smell of dry manure replaced the French lavender fragrances of his old bed. However, as he stared at the wooden ceiling where the moonlight bled through, Arthur felt an indescribable peace fill his chest. For the first time in years, he had been treated like a human being by someone who wanted nothing from him, simply because he appeared to have nothing to give. The image of Eliza's restrained smile, the woman who shared her own hunger with a stranger, wouldn't leave his thoughts. The next day, the rooster's crow tore through the silence of dawn before the sun even appeared on the horizon. A cold mist covered the property, turning everything into a pale, ghostly landscape. Arthur stood up, feeling every bone in his body protest. He washed his face with freezing water from a barrel near the barn and walked toward the house. Eliza was already up in the small, dirt-floored kitchen, stoking the fire in the wood stove. The smell of strong coffee and smoke filled the air, a combination that brought a strange sense of home to the Baron's heart. She poured the hot coffee into a small clay mug and offered it to him, along with a piece of hardened cornbread from the day before. When he reached out to take the mug, Eliza's thick, warm fingers accidentally brushed against his skin. It was a quick touch, just a second, but it caused their eyes to meet above the steam rising from the coffee. Eliza quickly lowered her head, hiding a slight blush on her soot-smudged face, and murmured an apology, hurrying to grab her own hoe leaning against the wall. Arthur felt his heart race in a way he hadn't experienced since his youth. Work in the field began as soon as the sun broke through the fog. Eliza pointed to the large area full of weeds and tall grass suffocating the bean crop. She handed a heavy, thick-handled hoe to Arthur. The Baron, who hadn't touched a heavy tool in over 15 years, gripped the hoe firmly and started clearing the weeds. For the first 20 minutes his determination kept him at a strong pace, but soon the reality of his unaccustomed body exacted its toll. The sun climbed relentlessly in the sky, burning his exposed neck. His back ached, as if being crushed by stones. But the worst wasn't the muscular fatigue. It was his hands. Beneath the dirt he had purposefully rubbed on his body, Arthur's skin was soft, well treated with lotions, and accustomed only to holding fountain pens and porcelain teacups. The constant friction of the rustic wooden handle didn't take long to tear open massive blisters on the palms of his hands. By mid-morning, the pain became almost unbearable. Arthur stopped for a moment, dropped the hoe, and looked at his own hands. One of the blisters had popped, leaving raw flesh exposed and caked with dirt, bleeding slightly. He let out a muffled groan of pain, clenching his teeth so as not to complain aloud. Eliza, who was hoeing a few rows ahead with the agility of someone who had spent her entire life in the fields, noticed that the steady rhythm of Arthur's work had stopped. She turned around, wiping her sweat-drenched face, and walked over to him. Without asking permission, Eliza took hold of the man's wrists and turned the palms of his hands upward. The silence that formed between them was dense, carried only by the sound of cicadas in the distant trees. Eliza frowned, her brown eyes analyzing the wound and, more importantly, analyzing the skin around the wound. There were no old calluses. There wasn't the thick, hard, yellowish skin typical of men who spend their lives on the hoe. They were delicate hands, injured by an effort they clearly weren't accustomed to. She slowly raised her eyes, meeting Arthur's tense gaze. He knew he had been caught in a lie. His heart hammered against his ribs, fearing she would kick him out, thinking he was a con man or a fugitive from justice. But Eliza didn't yell. She didn't launch into interrogating questions. Her gaze softened, taking on a tone of silent understanding. With extreme gentleness, she pulled out a small, clean cotton cloth she kept in the pocket of her dress, told him to hold still, and tied the fabric around his injured hand, covering the exposed flesh to protect it from the dirt. As she carefully tied the knot, the scent of lye soap radiating from Eliza's clothes invaded Arthur's nostrils, mixed with the sweet smell of honest labour's sweat. She whispered, still looking at his hands, that the earth was hard and unforgiving to those who didn't know its secrets, but that the pain of the first calluses was the price one paid to put down roots somewhere. Arthur's heart skipped a beat. Not only was he fascinated by the kindness of this incredible woman, but he was profoundly moved by the fact that she chose not to judge him. She realized he wasn't the experienced ranch hand he claimed to be, realized he was hiding something, but instead of demanding explanations, she offered care. Arthur looked at his own hands bandaged by the simple cloth, then looked into Eliza's eyes and felt something warm, intense and true ignite in his chest. He murmured a thank you with a choked voice, promising himself that he would continue the work until the end of the day, even if his hands bled, because he didn't want to disappoint the only person who had treated him with genuine humanity in years. The following weeks began to weave a quiet and intimate routine between the two. The forced cohabitation, due to the property's isolation, transformed the relationship of boss and helper into a deep and unbreakable partnership. Arthur, despite the initial aches and suffering, gradually toughened the skin of his hands and the muscles of his body. The disguised baron learned to milk the cow on cold mornings, learned to mend broken fences, and to haul heavy buckets of water from the well. And with every task he performed to lighten the load on Eliza's shoulders, the woman realized the exhaustion in her own body was fading. For the first time in a long while, Eliza didn't feel the crushing weight of loneliness. And in the most mundane details, the affection between them began to bloom, subtle as the first spring flowers on the frontier. At night, after an exhausting day of work, they would usually sit on the front porch. The darkness surrounding the farm enveloped them like a protective cloak, and the only light came from a kerosene lantern hanging on a nail in the wooden beam. Arthur, momentarily forgetting his disguise as a simpleton, would begin to tell stories. He didn't speak of material wealth or elegant high society dinners, for that would betray him. Instead, he spoke about the distant places he had visited in the past, about the constellations that dotted the sky, and about the books of ancient poets he had read. Eliza listened to it all, enchanted, sitting on her bench with her hands resting in her lap, her eyes shining as they reflected the yellow flame of the lantern. She noticed the beautiful words he used, his cultured way of structuring sentences, the mystery of that man who carried the education of a prince in the clothes of a beggar. On one of those nights, while Eliza was mending the torn shirt Arthur wore during the day, making careful little stitches with a rusted needle under the dim light, Arthur couldn't take his eyes off her. He watched the concentration on her serene face, the lock of dark hair that escaped her braid and fell over her eyes, the dedication with which she cared for his things. The Baron felt an uncontrollable urge to reach for her face and tuck that stubborn lock behind her ear. The physical proximity on the small porch made the air feel thicker. Eliza, feeling the weight of the man's intense gaze upon her, stopped the needle mid-fabric and slowly raised her face. Their eyes met, locked in a silent magnetism. The sound of the crickets around them seemed to vanish. There was a brief instant where Arthur leaned his body slightly forward, his breath hitched, his heart beating wildly against his ribs, and Eliza gripped the fabric of the shirt tightly in her hands, her lips slightly parted in contained anticipation. But the moment of enchantment and closeness was brutally interrupted by the sharp, violent sound of galloping horses braking abruptly on the dirt road in front of the property. The dust cloud was still rising, illuminated by the moon, when a harsh, authoritative voice cut through the tranquility of the night. Colonel Silas, accompanied by two henchmen with hardened features, halted the horses at Eliza's gate, the shadows of their hats hiding the cruel intentions on their faces. The deadline was drawing to a close, and the peace Arthur and Eliza had built over those weeks was about to be tested by the unforgiving fire of greed and malice. And the mystery of who the drifter truly was would need to be revealed before the woman he had learned to love lost the only thing she had left in the world. The sound of the horses' hooves slamming violently against the dry earth echoed through the night, shattering the fragile magic that had formed on the small porch. The reddish dust rose in thick clouds, invading Arthur and Eliza's nostrils as three riders stopped abruptly next to the rotting wooden gate. The faint moonlight revealed the imposing silhouette of Colonel Silas, mounted on a beautiful black stallion that snorted with impatience. Flanking the colonel, two men with scar-marked faces and cruel eyes kept their hands resting dangerously close to the sheaths of their machetes. Eliza felt the blood freeze in her veins, and the needle she held slipped, lightly pricking the tip of her finger. She stood up abruptly, her cotton dress brushing against the wood of the bench, and walked to the edge of the porch with her heart hammering in her throat. Arthur, momentarily forgetting the ache in his newly calloused hands, stood up right behind her, positioning his body subtly, almost like a protective shield between the woman who had taken him in and the threat that had just arrived. Colonel Silas adjusted his wide-brimmed leather hat and looked at Eliza with a sneer that didn't reach his cold eyes. With a deep voice dripping with arrogance, he said the night was awfully pretty for lovers' meetings, but that he hadn't ridden out there to admire the stars. The powerful rancher spat on the ground, very close to Arthur's dirty boot, and demanded to know if the girl already had the money for her dead parents' debt, reminding her that the interest had turned the sum into a small fortune. Eliza swallowed hard, clutching her dirt-stained hands at her waist, and replied with a trembling voice, but laden with dignity, that the colonel knew perfectly well the drought had punished the harvest. She explained that she barely had beans to eat, let alone the silver coins he demanded, and begged for a few more months, promising she would hand over the entire next corn crop if he just had a little patience and Christian mercy. The colonel's harsh laugh tore through the silence of the frontier, accompanied by the restrained chuckles of his henchmen. Silas leaned over the saddle of his horse, the leather creaking under his weight, and replied in a mocking tone that the bank in town didn't accept mercy as payment, and that he wasn't a charity institution set up to support bankrupt folks. His small, cruel eyes shifted from Eliza and landed on Arthur's ragged figure. The colonel narrowed his eyes, sizing the man up from top to bottom, noting the torn shirt and the frayed straw hat. With a tone heavy with disgust, the colonel asked if that scarecrow was the farm's new acquisition, mocking that Eliza had sunk so low as to pick up the trash Mrs. Agatha had swept off the sidewalk of the general store days ago. He laughed, saying a beggar couldn't save those miserable lands even if he worked for 100 years straight. Arthur felt his blood boil in a way he hadn't felt since his youth. The entirely polite posture he had tried to maintain threatened to crumble under the weight of that gratuitous humiliation, not directed at him, but at the woman standing by his side. The disguised baron took a step forward, his fists clenched at his sides, his jaw locked tight. He looked directly into the colonel's eyes, without lowering his head, and said with a firm voice, surprisingly deep and devoid of the country drawl he had been trying to imitate, that the true misery of a man isn't measured by the number of holes in his clothes, but by the lack of character in his soul. The words echoed in the dark, heavy and polished, causing an immediate sense of unease. The colonel stopped laughing, surprised by the audacity and the vocabulary of that tramp. One of the henchmen reached for his machete, waiting for the boss's order to teach the insolent fool a lesson. Eliza, terrified at the possibility of seeing Arthur hurt, quickly grabbed his arm, her fingers sinking into the worn fabric of his shirt. She looked at the colonel with eyes full of unshed tears and pleaded with him to forgive the hired hand's insolence, claiming the man was tired and didn't know who he was talking to. Silas yanked the horse's reins, the animal taking nervous steps backward. With a face red with contained fury, the rancher pointed a thick finger in Eliza's direction and decreed his final verdict. He shouted that he would return in exactly 7 days, next Friday, before the sun went down. He said that if she didn't hand over the money counted out on the table, he would tear the door off that old house and take the deed to the property the easy way or the hard way, advising her to start packing her bindles and her pet scarecrow to vanish from the town. Without waiting for a response, the colonel dug his spurs into the horse and galloped off, followed by his henchmen, leaving behind only the smell of animal sweat and a suffocating cloud of dust. The silence that followed was deafening. Eliza slowly let go of Arthur's arm, her legs giving out. She walked to the wooden pillar of the porch and slid down until she was sitting on the dirt floor, hiding her face between her knees. The crying, which she had held back with so much strength in front of her enemy, finally escaped in painful, muffled sobs. It was the cry of someone who had fought against the current her entire life and finally realized she was going to drown. Arthur felt his heart clench in an indescribable way. In his old life of wealth, he would solve that problem by signing a check without even glancing at the amount. But here, dressed in rags and with calloused hands, he felt the true agony of powerlessness. He walked slowly over to her, knelt in the dirty earth without caring about his already patched trousers, and reached out with extreme care, touching the woman's trembling shoulder. Eliza raised her tear-streaked face, her brown eyes shining with despair, reflected in the lantern's light. She whispered with a choked voice that it was all over, lamenting that the lands where her parents had sweat blood would be taken by an evil man, and that she wouldn't even have a roof for shelter. Arthur couldn't bear to see that pain. With a gentleness that contrasted with his rustic appearance, he used his thumb to wipe away a tear rolling down her cheek. The touch of his rough skin against Eliza's wet face sent a shiver down both their spines. He looked deeply into her eyes, and with a conviction that seemed to come from the very bottom of his soul, promised that she wouldn't lose her home. He said in a low, velvety voice that as long as he had breath in his lungs, the colonel would not lay a finger on those lands. Eliza blinked, confused and marveling at the strength of that gaze. For a moment, the despair gave way to a warm feeling that blossomed in her chest. She didn't know how a miserable drifter could keep such a promise, but the truth in Arthur's tone made her believe that miracles could still happen. In the days that followed, the atmosphere on the property became thick and heavy with a silent urgency. Autumn began to bare its claws, bringing biting winds and dark clouds that gathered on the horizon, threatening storms the dry earth wasn't prepared to receive. Arthur worked like a man possessed. He woke hours before dawn and hoed, mended fences, chopped firewood, trying to get the property into the best condition possible, as if physical effort could somehow delay the colonel's deadline. He didn't want to stop. He didn't want to think. His physical proximity to Eliza had become constant. As they passed each other in the cramped yard, their arms would brush, generating invisible sparks that made both avert their eyes. Their cheeks flushed. When they sat down to eat their meager daily meal, their gazes met over the raw wooden table, loaded with unspoken words and an affection that grew deep roots in the lonely baron's heart. It was on the afternoon of the 4th day that climatic tragedy struck the farm. The sky, once blue, turned an oppressive purple, and a deafening thunderclap shook the ground. The rain poured down, not as a blessing, but as a violent punishment. The strong wind threatened to tear off the loose roof tiles of the barn, where the few sacks of corn Eliza had managed to harvest were stored. Arthur, seeing the woman's despair at watching her livelihood risk rotting from the water, ran into the storm without a second thought. The freezing water soaked his clothes in seconds, sticking the thin fabric to his body. He climbed onto the slippery roof of the barn, battling the wind that cut his skin like a razor, using pieces of old canvas and heavy rocks to cover the gaps where the water was pouring in. Eliza, down below, held the wooden ladder with all her might, screaming for him to come down, terrified by the possibility of lightning striking him or of him slipping to his doom. The disguised Baron fought the fury of nature for nearly 2 hours. When he finally climbed down, his lips were blue from the cold and his body trembled uncontrollably. Eliza pulled him inside the small kitchen, shutting the door with difficulty against the howling wind. She quickly grabbed a thick towel and began drying his soaked hair, her face mere inches from his. Arthur's heavy breathing mixed with hers. He looked into Eliza's worried eyes, feeling the heat of her hands through the towel, and for a second the urge to kiss her right then and there, in the middle of the storm, was almost unbearable. He raised a trembling hand and touched her wrist, stopping the movements of the towel. Eliza swallowed hard, her lips slightly parted, their hearts beating in the same accelerated rhythm. But Arthur sneezed violently, his entire body racked by a deep chill that broke the spell of the moment. The reality of the cold and exhaustion had exacted its toll. The next morning, the sun shone weakly again over the wet earth, but the silence in the barn was disturbing. Eliza found it odd that Arthur wasn't in the kitchen for coffee and ran to the wooden annex at the back of the yard. Pushing the door open, she smelled the sour scent of sickly sweat. Arthur was thrown across the pile of hay, curled into a fetal position, breathing heavily and loudly. His face was bathed in sweat, pale as wax, save for 2 intensely red spots on his cheeks. The fever had arrived during the night, brutal and merciless. Eliza dropped to her knees beside him, pressing the back of her hand to the man's forehead, and almost recoiled from the absurd heat radiating from his skin. He was delirious, muttering incomprehensible words. Panic seized the woman. She knew what that fever meant on the frontier. It was the same sickness that had sent her parents to the grave in less than 3 days. And if your heart is aching seeing Eliza's sacrifice and despair, leave a comment telling us what you would do in her place. Don't forget to leave your like so this story of true love reaches more people. Eliza didn't think twice. She ran to the house, boiled water, prepared damp cloths, and spent the following hours swapping out cold compresses on Arthur's forehead, trying to lower the temperature of the body that was burning from the inside out. But the fever didn't break. In the midst of his delirious ramblings, the Baron thrashed in the hay, grabbing Eliza's hands with terrifying strength. With his eyes rolled back, he began to speak disconnected sentences. He muttered that gold didn't embrace, complained that the manor was cold and lonely, and begged his fake friends to leave him alone, saying he preferred death to the empty life he led. Eliza listened to those words with a tight heart, her forehead furrowed in confusion. Manor, gold, fake friends? None of it made sense coming from a drifter who ate leftover beans. But she shook her head, expelling the doubts from her mind. It didn't matter who he had been in the past, or what ghosts haunted him. At that moment, he was the man who had brought color back to her life, the man who had protected her harvest, the man she finally admitted to herself she was madly in love with. As late afternoon began to fall, Arthur's breathing grew shallower. Eliza realized that cold, wet cloths alone wouldn't be enough. He needed strong medicine. He needed quinine from the town apothecary. Desperation drove her. She ran to her tiny bedroom, opened a false bottom of a drawer in the old, termite-eaten wooden dresser, and pulled out a small, faded velvet box. Inside rested the only heirloom of value she possessed, her late mother's thick gold wedding band. It was her treasure, her guarantee against starving to death in the worst-case scenario, the only physical memory left of her family. Eliza didn't hesitate. She clutched the cold ring in the palm of her hand, threw a shawl over her shoulders, and ran down the muddy dirt road, leaving Arthur resting under heavy blankets. The miles-long walk to town felt like an eternity. Her feet sank into the mud, the cold wind punished her face, but the image of Arthur suffering in the barn made her run faster and faster. When she finally arrived at Mrs. Agatha's general store, the sun was already hiding. The place was full of ranchers drinking whiskey and young women gossiping while picking out cuts of fabric. Eliza burst in panting, her hair disheveled and her clothes stained with mud, drawing curious and disgusted stares from everyone present. She walked straight to the counter where Mrs. Agatha was chewing a toothpick with an air of superiority. With a voice broken from the run, Eliza placed the shiny gold ring on the worn wooden counter and asked, almost begging, for 2 vials of the best quinine and fever ointments. Mrs. Agatha picked up the ring, weighing the pure gold with greed shining in her small eyes. She let out a wicked laugh that caught the attention of the other customers, asking loudly and mockingly if the pauper had finally decided to sell the memories of her dead mother. The old shopkeeper leaned over the counter and asked with venom in her voice who that expensive medicine was for, insinuating that Eliza was getting rid of her treasure to save that dirty tramp she had picked up off the street. Whispers filled the store. People pointed, judging the lonely woman who dared spend fortunes on a nameless vagabond. Eliza raised her chin, her brown eyes flashing with fury and pride. With a voice that echoed through the entire store, she replied that what she did with her gold was her business alone, demanding the shopkeeper hand over the medicine before God punished her for her wicked tongue. The firmness in Eliza's words silenced the giggles. Mrs. Agatha, disgruntled but thrilled with the absurd profit she was making, grabbed the vials from the shelf, tossed them on the counter, and shoved the ring into her apron pocket. The night was already late when Eliza returned to the farm, her legs aching with exhaustion. She prepared the medication mixed in water and, with infinite patience, sat beside Arthur in the dark barn, holding his head in her lap to force him to swallow the bitter liquid drop by drop. She stayed awake all night, stroking the man's sweaty hair, praying every prayer she knew, and the sacrifice made out of love began to bear fruit. In the early hours of the morning before the sun rose, Arthur's breathing finally steadied. The scorching heat of his skin faded, giving way to a cold sweat that signaled the end of the fever. He slowly opened his heavy eyes, his blurred vision gradually gaining focus, and the first thing he saw was Eliza's tired, angelic face as she slept leaning against a wooden post of the barn, her hand still resting upon his chest. Arthur felt his throat was dry, but a crystalline clarity flooded his mind. He was alive. He looked at his own covered body, tasting the bitter tang of the expensive medicine in his mouth. As he tried to adjust himself, his gaze fell upon Eliza's left hand, which rested on the hay beside him. He knew that woman's story. He knew she didn't have a single red cent to buy medicine, but he had noticed weeks earlier a pale mark on her ring finger, the sign that she kept a precious band. The ring was no longer there. Comprehension struck the Baron's heart with the force of lightning. Throughout his entire life, surrounded by luxuries and false sycophants, no one had ever sacrificed a single piece of bread for him without expecting a millionaire's reward in return. And here was a woman in absolute destitution, who had parted with her only security in the world, the most valuable memory she possessed, to buy the life of an unknown drifter. Her love was real, tangible, and there was no price in the world that could repay it. Hot, silent tears rolled down Arthur's face, leaving tracks in the dust on his skin. He was no longer the disillusioned baron, nor the miserable drifter. He was a man reborn through genuine love, a love so strong and pure that it made him make the most important decision of his life. He needed to act fast, because Colonel Silas's deadline was about to expire. Moving with extreme caution, not to wake the woman who saved his life, Arthur stood up, feeling his body weak, but his soul indomitable. He walked silently to the kitchen, found a piece of rustic flower-wrapping paper and an extinguished stump of charcoal from the wood stove. With hands still trembling from weakness, but with the elegant, flourishing handwriting of an aristocrat educated in Europe, he wrote an urgent letter, sealing it folded in a peculiar manner. The Baron slipped off the property in the early hours of the morning, walking with difficulty to the main road. He waited until a caravan of trail bosses heading toward the state capital, Austin, passed by. Arthur approached the leader of the troop, a stern-faced wagon master. Under the suspicious gazes of riders who saw only a feverish beggar, Arthur reached into a false bottom of his torn leather belt and pulled out the only thing from his past he had brought with him. A heavy, solid silver button engraved with the Sterling family crest. He pressed the shiny button into the shocked wagon master's hand, along with the letter, and gave precise orders with a voice of unquestionable authority. He instructed that the letter be delivered directly into the hands of his estate manager at the main ranch of the territory, with no detours, promising the man would be rewarded with pure gold upon completing the delivery. The trail boss, recognizing the real silver and the commanding tone that didn't match the rags, nodded, pocketed the letter, and spurred his horse into a full gallop. When Arthur returned to the barn, the sun was already high. Eliza had woken up and was pacing back and forth in despair upon finding the bed empty, fearing that in his delirium the man had wandered into the woods. Seeing him walk in slowly, she let out a sigh of relief so deep that her legs gave out. Arthur caught her by the arms before she fell, resting his forehead against hers. Their breaths mixed once again, but this time there was a profound understanding, a silent complicity that required no words to be confirmed. She brought her ringless hand to his face, caressing his stubble. Arthur took that calloused hand and kissed the empty space on her finger with sacred reverence. The days that followed were a silent, agonizing countdown. In town, Colonel Silas was already celebrating the early acquisition of the lands, laughing in corners and saying he would finally have the cleanest water in the region for his cattle. Mrs. Igatha broadcasted to the four winds the story of the idiot who traded gold for medicine for a tramp who would soon die anyway, and everyone in town eagerly awaited Friday, hoping to watch the spectacle of the insolent woman's eviction. The humiliation was set. On the eve of the final day, the late afternoon painted the sky over Oakhaven in shades of orange and purple, as if nature itself knew of the impending clash. The tension on Eliza's small property was palpable, heavy as the air before a storm. She was sitting on the porch, sewing a tear in her calico dress with trembling hands, trying to hide the terror of becoming homeless the next morning. Arthur sat beside her, his body now recovered and his eyes shining with a new fierce intensity. He gently took the needle and fabric from her hands, forcing her to look at him. The Baron held both of Eliza's hands between his, transmitting a comforting warmth. With the sweetest and firmest voice she had ever heard, he whispered, asking her not to be afraid, no matter what happened the next day, guaranteeing that the love born in the drought of those arid lands would be stronger than any colonel or any debt from the past, promising that when the sun set on Friday she would understand everything and their lives would change forever. Eliza merely closed her eyes, letting a single tear fall, choosing to blindly trust the man who had stolen her heart. Friday dawned with an unusual heaviness in the air, as if the very sky of the Texas frontier held its breath in reverence to the pain that was about to unfold. The sun rose timidly, hidden behind a thick layer of grey clouds that filtered the light, leaving Eliza's small property plunged into a melancholic gloom. The morning silence wasn't the peaceful silence of the countryside, but rather the funereal quiet of farewells. Inside the timber shack, the rough sound of fabric brushing against wood echoed through the empty bedroom. Eliza was kneeling on the packed dirt floor, folding her few pieces of faded clothing and packing them into a bindle made from an old sheet. Her movements were slow, mechanical, as if every fold required superhuman strength. She wasn't crying anymore, for her tears seemed to have dried up during her sleepless night. There was only a bitter, profound resignation. She looked at the crooked walls her father had raised with his own hands, ran her trembling fingers over the marks on the doorframe where her mother used to measure her height as a child, and felt her chest tighten in a way that stole all her air. In the small kitchen, the smell of weak coffee mixed with the aroma of burnt wood. Arthur was standing by the window, observing the empty yard. He was already wearing his patched hired hand clothes, but the hunched posture of the previous days had completely vanished. He stood tall, his broad shoulders tensed, his jaw locked in an expression of absolute concentration, his dark eyes fixated on the dirt road leading to town, calculating the time, measuring the hours. He knew his main estate's carriage was on its way, but the muddy roads from the storm days ago might have delayed his manager. When Eliza entered the kitchen, carrying her small bundle of clothes, the image of that strong, proud woman, reduced to carrying her life in a piece of cloth, broke what was left of Arthur's defenses. He walked up to her with firm steps, stopped inches away, and, with a gentleness that contrasted with his now calloused hands, held her shoulders. With a velvety voice full of restrained urgency, the disguised Baron asked her to unpack that bundle. He looked deep into the woman's frightened brown eyes and stated that no one would take her from that house as long as he was alive to prevent it. Eliza lowered her head, a tired sigh escaping her cracked lips. She replied in an almost inaudible whisper that hope was a luxury the poor couldn't afford, and thanked him for trying to comfort her, but reminded him that the law of rich men was ruthless and that Colonel Silas would have no mercy. Arthur gently lifted her chin with his index finger, forcing her to meet his determined gaze, and declared with conviction that the law of men might be flawed, but divine justice always found its way, and that she should trust him for just a few more hours. The warm touch of his hand on her face made Eliza's heart race. For an instant, forgetting the misery and despair, she allowed herself to close her eyes and lean her face against the man's palm, absorbing that mysterious strength he exuded, wishing that silent moment of affection could last forever. But the real world didn't forgive the pauses of the heart. The muffled sound of hooves striking the dirt floor began to vibrate under their feet, growing with every second. It wasn't just one horse, it was a small crowd. Arthur and Eliza stepped out onto the side porch, their eyes narrowed against the faint morning light. At the end of the road, kicking up a suffocating cloud of dust, came Colonel Silas mounted on his black stallion. But he wasn't alone. Flanking the rancher were his foremost violent henchmen, and right behind them, a mule-drawn buckboard brought Mrs. Agatha, the store owner, accompanied by a few people from town. Human malice had a habit of turning another's misfortune into a spectacle, and the neighborhood had come to get front-row seats to the eviction of the woman who dared defy the natural order of things, trading gold for medicine for a sick outsider. Eliza's heart hammered wildly. She clasped her dirt-stained hands together and swallowed hard, feeling her legs go weak as the caravan of terror stopped right in front of her rotting gate. Colonel Silas didn't bother to dismount. He stopped majestically in the center of the yard, the leather of his saddle creaking in the heavy silence. Mrs. Agatha climbed down from the buckboard with difficulty, adjusting her shawl over her plump shoulders, a sneer playing on her painted lips, her small eyes gleaming with anticipation. The colonel adjusted his hat, looked at Eliza with profound contempt, and, with a voice that thundered across the yard, demanded to know if the pauper already had the silver coins stacked on the table, or if he would have to order his men to drag her junk out into the brush. The town gossip let out a shrill giggle, commenting loudly to her neighbours that the only thing of value the woman owned had already been spent to save a sick piece of trash who couldn't even hoe a crop properly. Mrs. Agatha's venomous words cut through the air, but Eliza, summoning the last ounce of pride she had left, stepped down the 2 porch stairs and walked toward the colonel. With her head held high and her spine straight, Eliza declared loudly and clearly that she didn't have the money. She explained that the land hadn't yielded enough crops and that her debt couldn't be paid that day, but bravely stated that the colonel knew very well those lands were worth 10 times the amount her parents had borrowed. Silas let out a cruel guffaw, pulling on the reins of his horse, which took a nervous step forward. The rancher scoffed, saying he was the one who dictated the value of the land, and that to his eyes that dust wasn't even worth his animals' manure, except for the water spring. With an arrogant wave of his hand, he ordered his henchmen to invade the house and throw everything they found out into the open, shouting that the lands now belonged to him by right. It was in that exact moment, when the first henchman tapped his boot on the first step of the porch, that a voice of thunder paralyzed everyone. Arthur stepped down from the porch with a cold, controlled fury in his eyes. He no longer walked like a tired, hired hand. He walked with the imposing presence of a king whose castle had just been invaded. The disguised baron stopped between the henchman and Eliza's door, blocking the path with his own body. With a tone of authority that made even the colonel's stallions step back instinctively, Arthur ordered that no one take another single step toward that house, warning that the man who touched Eliza Hayes's property would bitterly regret it until the last day of his life. The crowd held its breath. The contrast between Arthur's ragged clothes and the absolutely aristocratic posture of his body created a bizarre and hypnotizing scene. And if your heart is in your hands, rooting for justice to be served and for Arthur and Eliza's love to conquer all this humiliation, take a second and leave a comment about what you would do to the colonel if you were in the Baron's shoes. Don't forget to leave your like to help us keep telling these emotional stories. Colonel Silas blinked a few times, processing the insolence of that vagabond. His face turned red with rage, and the veins in his neck bulged. He pointed his leather riding crop at Arthur's face and raged, asking who a mud-caked beggar thought he was, to give orders on his lands, threatening to have his men tie the bold fool to a tree and whip him until he learned to respect his betters. Mrs. Agatha put a hand to her chest, gasping in fake indignation, saying that was the height of absurdity and that the sheriff should be called to arrest that crazy outsider. Eliza, terrified that Arthur might be hurt, ran up to him and tried to pull him by the torn sleeve of his shirt, begging with tear-filled eyes for him not to confront the colonel, pleading that his life was worth more than any piece of land. But Arthur didn't move. He held Eliza's trembling hand firmly, intertwining his fingers with hers in a public gesture of protection and affection that made the woman's heart skip a beat. He looked at Silas with an icy smile on his lips, the smile of someone holding a power the mortals before him couldn't even begin to comprehend. With terrifying calmness, the Baron replied that the colonel was gravely mistaken about who owned things in that place, and suggested the rancher look down the road behind him before speaking about superiority. The firmness in Arthur's words was so absolute that Silas instinctively turned his head to look over his own shoulder. The curious crowd did the same, and what they saw made the blood freeze in the veins of every single person present in that yard. The steady, powerful sound of dozens of galloping horses broke through the morning mist. These weren't ordinary workhorses. They were purebreds, with shining coats and majestic builds, marching in impeccable military-like formation. Leading the retinue, a stunning carriage of dark varnished wood, with solid gold accents and wine-red velvet upholstery, approached at a steady speed. The Sterling family crest shone imposingly on the doors of the carriage. The men riding alongside wore riding attire of the highest quality, polished boots and elegant hats. The sight of such wealth in such a forgotten town was like a terrifying mirage. Colonel Silas backed his horse up, his eyes wide, his arrogance washing down the drain in the face of a financial power that would crush his small ranch like an insect. Mrs. Agatha stood with her mouth hanging open, the toothpick dropping into the dust without her even noticing. Eliza squeezed Arthur's hand tightly, confused and in awe, completely failing to understand what was happening. The cavalcade entered Eliza's yard. The riders formed a perfect circle, isolating the colonel and his men. The carriage stopped smoothly in the center. The driver jumped down quickly and opened the door with a deep bow. Out stepped Arthur's trusted estate manager, a middle-aged man dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, holding a heavy hardwood box with gold hardware and an alligator leather briefcase. The manager completely ignored the frightened presence of the colonel and the rustic crowd. He walked with firm steps toward the porch, stopped 6 feet away from the ragged man dressed in dirty tatters, and, to the absolute and paralyzing shock of the entire town of Oakhaven, the suited man dropped to one knee in the dust, lowered his head in a sign of total submission, and with a voice thick with relief, stated loud and clear that he thanked the heavens for finding Lord Arthur Sterling safe, reporting that he had brought everything His Excellency had ordered in the sealed letter. A murmur of pure terror rippled through the crowd. The women covered their mouths with their hands. The colonel's henchmen took wavering steps backward, releasing the grips on their machetes as if the iron had suddenly turned white-hot. Colonel Silas lost all color in his face, his skin becoming as pale as old candle wax. He looked at the tramp he had just insulted and threatened with death, and suddenly he saw the majestic posture, the indomitable gaze, the complete lack of a country drawl, the perfect teeth that poor folks simply didn't possess. The beggar, the scarecrow, the trash swept off the sidewalk, was none other than one of the richest and most influential men in the entire country. Eliza, at Arthur's side, let go of his hand as if she had been shocked. She took a step back, her brown eyes wide open, her breath catching in her throat, looking at the man she loved as if he were a ghost materialized before her. Arthur paid no mind to the terrified stares of the crowd. He gave a subtle nod to his manager, who immediately stood up and opened the thick wooden box on the lid of an empty barrel. The blinding gleam of pure gold, overflowing in flawless coins, reflected in the greedy and now desperate eyes of the colonel. The baron took a step forward, walking right up to Silas's horse. He looked at the trembling rancher, who now looked like a frightened little boy sitting in the saddle, and with a voice as sharp as a blade of ice, questioned in a lethal tone what the miserable amount of the debt was that had been tormenting Miss Eliza's peace. The colonel stuttered, incapable of forming a complete sentence, sweating cold beneath the shadow of his hat, murmuring an insignificant amount in the face of the fortune exposed. Arthur didn't wait any longer. He grabbed a handful of the heavy gold coins from the box and, in an overwhelming gesture of contempt, threw them directly at the hooves of Silas's horse into the dirt on the ground. The metallic clink of gold hitting dirty earth echoed like thunderous justice. The baron declared in a loud voice that the debt was paid, demanding that the colonel make his henchmen pick up that loose change from the ground like the crawling creatures they were, and that they vanish from that town before he decided to buy not just the dry lands, but the colonel's entire ranch, the town bank, and turn Silas into one of his stable washers. The sheer terror in the humiliated rancher's voice was evident as he screamed orders at his men to gather the coins. They dropped to their knees in the dirt, snatching up the gold under the merciless gaze of the baron's riders. In a matter of seconds, the arrogant caravan turned tail and fled at a full gallop, defeated, humiliated, and exposed in their own smallness. The crowd that had previously laughed at Eliza now kept their eyes glued to the ground, fearing the baron's wrath. Arthur turned slowly, his gaze crossing the space until it found Mrs. Agatha, who was trying to hide behind the other women, shaking from head to toe. The Baron pointed a sharp finger in the direction of the gossiping store owner and ordered her to step forward. The woman walked, dragging her feet, sweating profusely, her fat hands shaking uncontrollably. Arthur didn't need to raise his voice. He merely extended his open right palm toward her and demanded the immediate return of the sacred object she had taken from the purest, most honest woman he had ever met, instructing his manager to pay the woman double what the medicine was worth, so she could never say the Sterling family left unpaid debts. Mrs. Agatha reached a trembling hand deep into her apron, pulled out the antique gold wedding band, and placed it into Arthur's firm hand, muttering disjointed apologies, before turning around and running back to her buckboard, humiliated in front of the entire town. She used to dominate with her gossip. When the last onlooker finally disappeared around the bend of the dirt road, and only the majestic horses of the retinue remained silent in the yard, Arthur turned to Eliza. The woman was leaning against the porch beam, her hands covering her mouth, tears of shock, relief, and confusion flowing freely down her face, which was now bathed by the sun that finally broke through the grey clouds. The Baron dismissed his men with a look, silently ordering them to step back to give the couple privacy. He walked slowly up to Eliza, his holed shoes and torn clothes contrasting with the shining gold ring he held with reverence. Arthur stopped in front of her, his previously hard and authoritative gaze melting into a pool of pure tenderness and devotion. He took a deep breath, confessing in a low voice that he owed her the greatest of all apologies for having lied about his name and his origins. He told her how greed and appearances had sickened him to the point of making him run away from his own life in search of a spark of true humanity. And then, his voice choked with emotion, the Baron declared that he had walked through the hell of falsity, only to be saved by the most beautiful angel inhabiting that frontier. He said that when wealthy women saw his dirty clothes, they shooed him away like trash. But when Eliza saw his hunger, she shared her only plate of food. And when death came to collect his soul through the fever, she gave up her most precious and sacred memory to buy the medicine that saved him. He dropped to one knee right there on the rustic floor of the timber shack's porch, took Eliza's trembling left hand, and smoothly slid her late mother's wedding band back onto her ring finger. Looking up at her with absolute veneration, Arthur pleaded for her to allow him to spend the rest of his days trying to be worthy of such a grandiose love, asking the humble woman to marry him, not as Baron Sterling, but as the man whose soul belonged entirely to her. Eliza, sobbing with happiness and her heart overflowing, fell to her knees in front of him, throwing her arms around the man's neck in an overwhelming and purifying gesture of love, her tears washing the face of the man who found the greatest of all riches where no one else dared to look. Years passed, and the waters of time washed away the old sorrows. Under the warm, golden sun of a spring morning, the massive veranda of the Sterling family's main ranch estate was bathed in a gentle breeze that swayed the pure linen curtains. The grand manor was no longer a cold and silent fortress. It resonated with life, joy, and the peace of a true home. Arthur, wearing fine cotton clothes but preserving the rustic hat that reminded him of where his redemption began, was sitting in a plush armchair holding a cup of coffee with a serene smile. He watched with profound adoration as the elegant woman with dark, shining hair, dressed in simple yet highly tasteful silk, strolled through the flowering garden. Eliza had become the most beloved and respected baroness in the entire region, not because of the titles of nobility she now carried, but because of her infinite kindness, transforming her husband's wealth into schools and aid for those most in need. When Eliza turned around, noticing her husband's passionate gaze following her, she smiled dazzlingly, a smile that erased the shadows of any past suffering. Arthur walked up to her, wrapping her in his arms amidst the sweet scent of the fields, aware that true luxury didn't lie in the gold, resting in the bank, but in the warmth of the hands of the woman who chose to love a drifter, building together an unshakable empire founded on absolute love, resilience, and the eternal truth of the heart.